Hello, I'm Julia Bradsher, and welcome to Take 5 with GFPI. Today I'm talking with Peter Clark, and Peter is a consulting process engineer and is also a contributing editor to Food Technology magazine. He's led teams that designed and built award-winning plants for companies such as Post, Carnation, and Hill's Pet Nutrition. He also worked internationally as a volunteer promoting food safety and processing under the USAID Farmer to Farmer program. He's speaking today at GFPI's Symposium on Trends in Food Protection Technology. And Peter, welcome.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start by asking you to talk about what you see are the top trends in food protection technology today.
Well, I think there's really two threads. One is a continuation of familiar and traditional techniques such as canning, for example, and freezing and dehydration, which we've had for years and which still work. And we categorize many of them as thermal processing. Mm-hmm. The other is non-thermal processing, which is driven by the desire to have a more fresh-like quality of foods, less cooking, if you will. On the other hand, so far they have been primarily in development, so we're a long way from them being high-volume commercial applications. Mm-hmm. A third influence, I think, is important, is the international requirement. You mentioned my volunteer work, and I've spent a lot of time in developing countries. They have almost no food processing, and so what we're certainly going to see is the incorporation of modern food protection mm-hmm. in the third world.
Okay. Great, thank you. And where do you see technology in this area, let's say 10 years from now?
Well, I think the international market and the developing countries will have come a long way in that period of time. They're on a very steep curve. I also think some of the technologies that are well known to be safe, but not in wide use, will have become more popular and more widely used. A perfect example of that, I think, is irradiation, mm-hmm. which we know works, has wide application, has encountered the impression of some resistance at the consumer level, which is not well supported by evidence. And I think over time, it's going to become much more widely applied.
Another question that we wanted to ask you is, we know that you're involved in the design of facilities, and how do you see the Food Safety Modernization Act affecting the planning of new facilities?
Well, up to now, only 3 segments of the industry have really been required to have HACCP plans, or Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point mm-hmm. plans. The FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, now makes that a requirement for everybody, or the equivalent. They actually use a different acronym, but the requirement is essentially the same. So that's primarily a management tool, but it has an influence on the plant design. So companies that have been able to get by with just barely adequate facilities are going to have to upgrade. The biggest impact is probably going to be on companies that export to the United States, but that's about half our food supply. So those companies are now going to be treated as if they were U.S. Firms, even though they're not. And so all the imported foods are going to be inspected and expected to have been produced under the same conditions mm-hmm. as if they were in the United States. That's going to have a big impact.
Could you give an example of an area that an upgrade will be required in order to follow HACCP?
Well, many plants tolerate standing water, for example, mm-hmm. Which really isn't very acceptable. A lot of plants don't have the kinds of finishes that really are required by good manufacturing practices and mm-hmm. safe procedures. They may find that the equipment that they've used for years just simply can't be cleaned to the degree that mm-hmm. it ought to be. So I think there's going to be a lot of retrofitting and upgrading. In the United States, we're not building a lot of new plants, but internationally we are.
Yeah.
And historically, companies going into the international market, quite frankly, didn't put the same standards in place that they would have in the United States. Now they're going to have to.
Yeah. Okay. And then my last question, given the number of firms from outside of the U.S. that are exporting here, where do you see technology addressing this, internationally? I mean, in what way will technology facilitate the tracking of food that's being brought into the U.S.?
Well, I think there's two opportunities, if you will, there. One is in what I think of as diagnostics. We're bringing in a lot of food, some of which is perishable, and it has to be it's going to be inspected at a greater frequency at the point of entry, and yet the clock is ticking. So we need improved technologies for analysis that will enable foods to clear the FDA inspection at the port of entry faster, just so they can get onto the market and they won't cost the importer and the exporter additional money. I think we'll also see advanced technologies being applied in the international market, in part because they are starting from scratch. So go back to my first answer, I think what we think of as old-fashioned technologies like canning are still going to be applied because they're rugged, they're simple, we know how they work, and that's a good technique for preserving foods that otherwise are being wasted in tropical countries especially. But I think they also have the opportunity to introduce high-pressure processing or irradiation and some of the others that we're looking at because the slate is clean. There's nothing in place. We're not going to replace a cannery today that's operating perfectly fine with something else because it's doing its job. But if you're building a brand new plant to preserve fruits or vegetables in Africa, you can do anything you want. And I think people are going to do that.
Okay. Well, thank you for your insights, Peter.
You're welcome.
And that's it for this episode of Take 5 with GFPI.